Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this televised panel coming to you from the African Development Bank annual meetings that are currently in session in Lusaka, Zambia. The African Development Bank has, under its new leadership, President Adesina, highlighted 5 key priorities for transforming Africa, known as the High Fives, namely, light up and power Africa, feed Africa, industrialize Africa, integrate Africa, and improve the quality of the lives for all of Africa's people. At the top of the AfDB's agenda is Africa's Energy Challenge. To take this discussion further, I am joined by His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda. His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, President of the Republic of Kenya, and Dr. Adesina, who is President of the African Development Bank. Before we proceed, I want to put some stats on the table that bring in some voices that are not represented in this room. Africa accounts for 16% of the world's population. It's difficult to rationalize then that Africa also accounts for 53% of the world's population that does not have access to electricity. Borrowing from the Africa Progress Report 2015, which is Power People Planet, a woman living in a village in northern Nigeria pays up to 60 to 80 times per unit of energy more than a resident of New York City because she is not connected to the grid. 900 million Africans use less electricity than 47 million people living in Spain. 645 million Africans do not have access to electricity. 700 million Africans do not have access to clean cooking fuel. 600,000 Africans die on an annual basis due to polluted household air, and half of those are children. President Adesina, the New Deal on energy for Africa, what is different and how are you going to catalyze the energy landscape across the African continent, sir?
Well, thanks again. I think the numbers that you gave out essentially talks about the real issue we have to face. First, it doesn't make any sense at all that Africa today is known for darkness, right? In particular, when you start the kind of statistics you gave about 645 million people not having access to electricity, and even to do a basic thing like cooking, right, which we all take for granted. You've got 700 million people that don't have access to clean cooking energy. No, we have made a decision that it starts at it starts. We're tired of them, right? Africa needs to solve this problem. In solving that problem, we've got to realize that we're also sitting on massive amount of potential. Don't forget that on this continent, right, we have so much solar potential, right? We can use all the sun until it becomes the moon. We got sun everywhere, right? We've got geothermal in where these presidents, President Kagame and President Kenyatta are there. We've got a lot of wind power. We have a lot of hydropower. We've got everything. So the key really for us is we've determined as the African Development Bank that Africa cannot go forward without actually having electricity. You need electricity for schools. You need it to get vaccines in the hospitals. You need small and medium-sized businesses to have electricity. And industries don't run on air. They run on power. And so we've said that the critical thing that we must do is make sure that Africa has access to universal electricity within 10 years. It's not a brain surgery. We can do that, you know. And the key really for that is the African Development Bank has made a decision that will prioritize the New Deal on energy for Africa. And our goal is pretty clear, right? We want to add 160 gigawatts of electricity to the grid. We want to add 130 million people connected to the grid. And to just give you an idea of that, it's like going to President Kenyatta's country where they have KenGen that's doing a great job, and you do it 90 times. It allows you to do that. We want to connect 75 million people to the off-grid systems. And President Kenyatta's country has a fantastic thing called M-Copper, in which they are able to do that. You do that 300 times, that problem is solved. And we want to connect 150 million people to clean cooking energy. And that's why the bank has decided to put $12 billion of its own resources on the line to address this problem. but also to leverage others.
That 12 billion is over 5 years, the investment.
That's 12 billion over 5 years, but we plan to leverage 45 to 50 billion dollars of private sector money into that particular space. Now, the thing to really understand is the fact that these presidents are doing incredible work. You look at President Kagame in his country. I always say that, his country is a very small country, but it's like Intel in a computer. He's doing amazing things as a president. President Kenyatta is doing tremendous things in terms of renewable energy and all of that in Kenya. So we have worked with our presidents, and they've made a political decision that Africa is tired of darkness. And we, as the African Development Bank, that is the bank for the continent, we've made the decision that we're going to back Africa in terms of grid-based power, mini-grid power, off-grid power. At the end of the day, we've got to realize that when we talk about energy, we need energy for three things. Energy to light up the bulb, energy to allow us to be able to industrialize, so we need base load power. We also need energy for clean cooking. And so I just wanted to be clear that we're not just talking about lighting the bulb. People lit that 138 years ago with Thomas Edison. That's not the big deal. The big deal for us, for these economies of Kenya to move, economies of Rwanda to move, of Africa's economy that gets 5% shaped up on their GDP, is to have base load power.
And you use the analogy, sir, of energy being blood of the economy,
yes,
with which we will not survive.
Absolutely.
Then we bring President Kenyatta in. President Adesina mentioning the geothermal power plant, which, sir, is the 9th largest in the world. So congratulations. And I think what we want to do in this session is draw from the successes. How can we take what you've done and replicate that across the African continent? So how have you pulled in private sector investment into your energy projects in Kenya?
I think the first thing that we did is that we moved away from the vertical integration that we had, where we had, generation, transmission, distribution, all run by one central parastatal with all its inefficiencies. And we moved to a much more horizontal type arrangement, where we separated generation, transmission, and distribution into separate companies. And we focused largely, first and foremost, on generation as being the key, because we needed to get adequate power. We then went out and did major reforms to our entire energy sector in 1997 and passed all the necessary legislation that actually opened up the generation part of the industry. And through that, commercialized our own generation entity, as he's referred to it, our Kengen, commercialized it and made it to start operating on a commercial basis and a standalone and move through with that. We then created a geothermal development company, which was largely going to tap, because one of the biggest problems we found is, in order to attract private sector, we needed to, first of all, establish that we had proven reserves of geothermal. So our GDC, as we call it, went out ahead and started doing the key exploration. And this we invested in as a government, in GDC, to show and to prove that we do have adequate geothermal reserves. As a result of that, and putting in place a proper regulatory framework, we were able to show a success, a commercial success story in our own Kengen. We have been able to attract up to about, let's say, 30% of our energy requirements are pumped into the system by the private sector itself. We are having more private sector companies through PPPs and PPAs signing up power purchase agreements with our transmission and our distribution companies.
Is it true that you'll be doubling your geothermal capacity by the end of 2016?
We have already actually reached that target.
So you're moving quicker than the stats are accounted for.
We are now on about 650 megawatts of geothermal power, which is currently accounting for approximately some 40% of our energy requirements in Kenya, and we are still pushing to expand that. But now, with the environment created, we are now asking private sector to be the ones now to take the lead. Proven reserves, proven commercially operated entities that are working and making profit and money. And we're now saying, let the private sector now come in, right? And do the rest. We have opened up the space, we have opened up the path. Private sector can now actually come in and dominate, especially the generation side of the business.
President Kagame, Rwanda, you had energy access at around about 8% in 2010. That increased to some 24% in 2015. You've got installed capacity currently at 200 megawatts. You are targeting 563 megawatts come 2018. Again, I'm going to ask you, sir, as an example of the right development being made in the energy space, what lessons can we draw from you and from Rwanda specifically?
Well, let me give it a context. First, I wanted to add to what these leaders are saying. And I think this conversation and this moment and these leaders we have here on the panel are all very exciting for Africa in a sense that there is a new momentum, and we are trying to do now, and with a sense of urgency, what we should have done long ago. But it's never too late.
It's never too late.
We can. So I think that's the starting point. And why am I saying we are trying to do some of the things we should have done long ago? If you look at, in my own country, we are dealing with old problems as well as new problems we have to deal with. The old problems, for example, we found there were plans in my country for generation of power, but nothing else. So you can't generate power and you have no distribution capacity, you have no transmission capacity, or even the institutions that actually manage, meaning in terms of utilities in place, which I think President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya has just put right. There has to be reforms of these utilities that we have across the board in Africa, and then address those other issues. So for us in Rwanda, what the statistics you've given are in that context, and the progress we have made so far, and we are happy that with the sense of urgency in African Development Bank and the collaboration we have, for example, in the East African Community region, is very interesting because the new energy deal the president of the African Development Bank group is talking about is actually a big deal. And Rwanda from 7-8%, to 24%, then in fact and that is generally in access to grid power, while off-grid power we have started from 5 and we are moving towards 22. This is off-grid itself. And then the other figures which you have mentioned. But the approach for us has been threefold. One is making sure that we indeed have this right mix. What percentage do we have for off-grid? What do we have on-grid power to power industries, as well as, fulfill the obligation of lighting up Africa and powering Africa, meaning really industries, because some of these industries we are talking about as an objective of Africa and all our countries, we may not be able to achieve that by just off-grid solutions. So the right mix has been coming up, and so we have our own resources within the country, both from which we can generate power and limited means in terms of capital to invest. But we have also this capacity coming in to boost our own from, say, an institution like African Development Bank, and then the collaboration we have within the region. In fact, the other day, for example, Kenya wanted to give us power. They wanted to sell to us 30 megawatts. But
I hope you took it.
No, I was ready to take it, but there was no transmission capacity to. So this is why I started with what I was talking about. So we are trying to catch up on many things at the same time, but I think it's coming up very well. So unfortunately, power cannot be stored in this sense. The 30 megawatts Kenya wanted to give us is not just there waiting, being stored to be transmitted. Maybe when we have
lost power.
It's
I
lost
hope the
power.
offer's still on the table, President Kenyatta.
Yes.
It's not going to disappear anytime soon,
Yes.
President Kagame.
So,
President Adesina, why do Africans need to care about climate change? We looked at the stats at the top of this discussion. Why should we care?
Well, you know, if you take a look at Africa's contribution to climate change, it's absolutely nothing, right? Africa's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is only 2%, right? The rest of the developed world have been developing off the back of an Africa that actually was not contributing anything at all. But just about 3 weeks ago, I took a big trip around, and you look at East Africa, you look at Southern Africa, 13 or 14 countries that are going through serious problems of El Nino are in East and Southern Africa. President Kagame's country in Rwanda had floods, and President Kenyatta's country in Kenya had massive devastating floods. So you have a continent that has been shortchanged absolutely by climate change. My point is, it's time to actually have climate justice for Africa, and also to make sure that Africa is not shortchanged in terms of climate finance. Now, the critical things that we've got to do is to find out solutions that work and work fast. At the African Development Bank, I announced that we were making immediately available $549 million to support countries to cope with the emergency situation. But in addition to that, we're also going to support them to be able to build more climate-resilient economies, but especially in agriculture, that is quite susceptible to that. I was in Malawi, and I went to one of the farms, and we were going to the airport, and I picked up the maize cob, and it was just like this, right? And that's the aspiration of a whole household gone just like that. And so the three things I want to say about this as follows. First and foremost is that the amount of money that was promised, right, for $100 billion in COP21 for developing countries to do climate adaptation, that money, we have to see the color of it. That money has to be paid very quickly because the countries are suffering and suffering very, very hard. Second is that we have global finance mechanisms, right, for climate change. We have the Global Environment Facility. We also have the Green Climate Fund. Now, these two agencies need to pay up for the premiums for the African countries to be able to insure themselves with the African Risk Capacity Organization, which actually does fast disbursing funds when you're actually hit with catastrophic events like this. It worked for Senegal. Senegal was able to get $17 million payout from that. However, somebody has to pay for it. I think in this case, African countries should be asked to pay a lot for that. The global financial climate finance facilities should be able to do that. And lastly is to look for ways in which we build climate resilience for our economies themselves. In agriculture, I think looking at how we manage water use efficiency become very, very critical. In the energy sector, also making sure that we've got to reduce the deforestation we have. There's often a confusion, thinking that the problem of Africa on energy, the carbon emission is coming from the energy sector. Absolutely not. 85% of all the energy that we have is coming from firewood, from charcoal, and from biomass. That's what we call, quote-unquote, energy. But because of that, Africa is scavenging for energy. People are cutting down all the trees, and forest deforestation is massive, which, again, will reinforce the susceptibility to climate change. So we've got to solve Africa's energy situation if we're going to have any chance at all of solving the climate change problem. So we've got to link both, and that's why at this annual meeting, we're looking at both energy and we're looking at climate change.
So let's talk about the energy mix, President Kenyatta. What is the ideal energy mix that we're striving for? We've got an abundance of renewable resources on the African continent. That's where Africa is very rich. How do we get the balance right?
I think we've got to really focus on tapping on the natural resources that we already have. And in Kenya, for example, we have tried to maximize our utilization both of hydro, of geothermal, of wind, and solar. And with a clear focus on what we know and understand to have plenty of, which is geothermal. And as of today, as a country, like I said, we're about 40% of our requirement, 45% of our requirement being met through geothermal. About another 25 to 30% now through hydro, about 8% through wind, and some 6% through solar. So thermal is only about 10%. Right? And I believe that as a continent, we have tremendous resources that can enable us to really push the renewables over and above the thermals on this continent. And it is a question of how do we link the capacity available, for example, in Kenya, as President Kagame was saying, and how do we connect ourselves so that those who have an abundance of potential, especially in the green energy, countries like DRC, that have huge hydro potential, right? Over and above their requirements, how can we interconnect ourselves so that this power...
Are you bringing us to Inga Dam? I was holding that for President Adesina. It wasn't me. This time around, I didn't bring it into the conversation. It's all rested President Kenyatta.
No, it's critical. I think what the president is saying there, and both presidents are very passionate about it. In fact, we talked about it with President Kagame just about moments ago before we came on the television set. You know, potential is important. Africa has just told you about its potential. We've got potential for solar, 11 terawatts. Potential for hydro, 350 gigawatts. Potential for wind, another 150 gigawatts. Geothermal for him, it may be another 15 gigawatts. Inga Dam is 44,000 megawatts. But we're sitting on potential. Nobody lights up a house with potential. Nobody powers an industry with potential. We've got to work to do it. And I think on Inga Dam, we all agree that this is something that is more than the DRC, by the way. It's an asset for the whole of Africa. And we're working with the government. The African Development Bank is providing a lot of financing to help with this, and World Bank and others. But we've got to also look at how do we finance the transmission. President Kagame was talking about he wanted power, but there was no transmission. If you get the Inga working, and you've got to do the transmission line that goes right through many countries, and South Africa wants to have an uptake of it of about almost 2,500 megawatts. Question is, who pays for the electricity? This is where the bank comes in. We as a bank said that we will be willing to float power purchase bonds across all the countries where the electricity lines will go through, provided what President Kagame was saying about the reform of the sector in terms of the tariff. If there's cost-reflective tariff, we can easily float those bonds and make sure that this gets done. I can tell you that as leaders, we are determined to fully unlock that potential of the Inga Dam.
So I want to get President Kagame's view on what has happened over the last 2-year period, specifically with regard to Inga Dam. The Africa Progress Report that I referred to earlier in our discussion, again, power, people, and planet, indicates that there is progress being made on the ground, and that is being reiterated by what President Adesina says. If you could respond, sir, and then President Kenyatta, if you can come in.
Well, maybe we shouldn't be bogged down by Inga Dam as a project which holds so much for Africa here in terms of power, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much we speak about the right things to be done. the decision is made by somebody else somewhere, and all of us have got to wait whether that decision is going to be made. So in other words, I'm saying we may have the right ideas, we may have the best of intentions and express them, but at the end of the day, if a single voice is going to veto or dictate on the course of events, then you are stuck. But let me add a few things for the earlier question about the mix. Yes. One, that is really dictated by a number of factors. One is the availability of these energy resources from which we can produce electricity, whether it is geothermal, hydro. In our case, it is methane gas. And we're having so much, peat, coal, and we'll come back to that. I think the President of the African Development Bank said something useful about whether we really have to go entirely off-grid or renewables direction and forget something else with all the dangers involved. But that's a long debate. I'll come, maybe we shall have it another time. But if you look at these resources and then look at the needs can also be divided according to how we are going to invest. Lighting homes, lighting even streets, or lighting hospitals, schools, and so on, this may not need the kind of baseload power the African Development Bank president was talking about. You can use solar, you can use different kinds of off-grid solutions. But if you are powering industries, if you are talking about and separating rural areas and urban areas, or where the industries are located, then that will dictate the mix as well. That's number two. Three, it's the capacity in terms of capital to invest to produce whichever energy choice we have made to power or to light up homes. So all of these things will dictate which way we go, because we can't hold up, we can't hold on lighting homes, for example, and don't invest in solar or other off-grid solutions because we are waiting for INGA or some other, no, we have to do it at the same. Absolutely. On the ground. You look at the problem as it is, what the resources available, both in terms of where you are going to draw energy from, or the capital to invest, and how much of that, so that, again, it results into not only access, but also affordability of this energy we are providing.
We're not allowed to go further on INGA, so let's just leave that for now. Let's talk about utilities. They're the focus of much public anger, mismanagement, high levels of debt, corruption, and possibly largely to blame for where we find ourselves from an energy perspective on the African continent. You mentioned earlier, President Kenyatta, how you had dealt with the utility within your environment. Perhaps you can share some further ideas in terms of transforming utilities across the African continent.
We in Kenya took a decision that our sector was going to operate on a commercially based manner, whereby we would bring private sector initiatives into the industry. And we have seen it working superbly, like I said, to the point where 30% of our current power generation now is being done by the private sector. But that is because of the reforms that we did in the sector. We established a proper regulatory body that encouraged transparency in terms of the off-take agreements, so that there is open and clear transparency on the tariffs, on everything, so that people know what to expect. Very clear power purchase agreements also, right? That were similar and cross-board. So these are the critical ingredients of driving this sector. We've got to recognize as government that energy is a commodity like any other, and it has to be treated as such.
So it's difficult to challenge you, gentlemen, because the right political will is right here in this room. It's visible to everyone. But the question is that are all leaders of this caliber? And perhaps President Adesina. I won't let President Kagame off the hook. He'll come back. He's just got a moment longer to think about it in terms of African leadership. Can we widely state that African leadership is all working in the right direction?
Well, let me first quickly address one thing that President Kenyatta just said on the utilities, and to say that I fully agree with him. I think the critical things we have to do all across Africa on utilities is get access to the right technology, good management of the utilities, and good financing framework for them. When I was in Korea, I saw the utilities are so well managed that they told me that the downtime in their distribution network was 10.23 minutes. I had to almost ask them, do you mean 1.02 days or what? They say 10.23 minutes. I said, that's about all the time that we have electricity in most parts of Africa. So I think reforming the utilities is a big part of what we as the African Development Bank, under the New Deal on Energy, it's going to do. But to your point in terms of political will, I mean, these are great leaders here. We're just inspired by...
This is the Africa I want to live in.
You know, I mean, when we were in Kigali at the World Economic Forum, President Kagame hosted us to a lunch. And when he was closing the lunch, he got up and he said, well, I don't want to speak for all the other presidents, but I just want to say that I feel terribly ashamed that we don't have electricity in Africa. And then the next president picked it up, and the next president picked it up. And when I actually challenged our heads of state and I said, well, look, it's going to take money to do this, right? We will bring ours, but we need more money from the countries. And I was making the point that the share of our GDP we're spending on energy today is 0.3% in Africa. But if we increase that to 3.4%, we'll make about $54 billion available annually, which is about just the gap we need, you know. And then President Bongo of Gabon got up and said, well, look, we will do exactly that. That is what we're talking about. The fact that African leaders themselves feel that this has to change. They want to accelerate their growth and development. They want to add value to everything they produce. They want to create jobs for their own citizens. And you don't do that on air. You do it on power. I think the political will is extremely strong right now. I think, you know, since we launched a New Deal on Energy for Africa, you were there at the World Economic Forum. We had so many African heads of state there. So I feel excited. President Kagame said it, you know, that there is a degree of impatience right now to solve this problem. And so over to the leaders. They're the ones doing a great job of it.
Perhaps maybe we rephrase it and you say, does the good leadership outweigh strongly the bad?
Well, let me stick to one kind of argument. One is I see good progress being made across Africa. There is good commitment. There is clear commitment on delivering by leaders, and there is demand in the private sector. There is demand from the ordinary citizens. So there is pressure already, and there is also commitment by leaders. Maybe what we could be talking about is the speed at which we are moving, the right one. I think there is progress, but there needs to be made more progress than probably we are making. I think this is where the argument is. So we need to find some ways of accelerating what we are doing. But I think there is a commitment broadly by leaders. In some places, much more progress than in others. We are not all moving at the same time, speed and the pace. But I think really one has to be fair in a way, looking at where we are coming from and where we are now. There is much progress. There is hope today that we can even do better tomorrow. So I think that's what we need to keep emphasizing.
And perhaps picking up on that, President Kagame, to bring in President Kenyatta, one of the key themes at the World Economic Forum on Africa in Kigali, just last week or the week before, was the fact that Africa's battling to get long-term projects to bankability phase, and that there's a bottleneck forming right there. And perhaps that speaks to what President Kagame is saying, is that progress is slow. Can you perhaps enlighten us on your thinking about these large projects in the infrastructure space, particularly in the energy space, that need to get to bankability phase and that doesn't appear to be happening quickly enough?
I want to go back a little bit to what President Kagame said, this issue of commitment. I believe there is the commitment, and that commitment is across the continent. And I have seen it from talking with my colleagues, from the various meetings that we've had. There is clear commitment that something needs to happen and something needs to happen fast. I think the problem and the challenge is Africa has also many challenges. And where do you really put your focus? Where do you put your resources? I believe that we need to prioritize. We can't do everything in a go. And this is where energy, I believe, comes to the forecourt. If we can focus on energy, as we are doing, for example, in Kenya, because what is our greatest challenge? Our greatest challenge is to create jobs. We're not going to create jobs if we can't industrialize. We're not going to industrialize if we don't have power. So the first step in the path is we've got to be able to create adequate energy and not run away from the fact that these are mega projects, right? And this is really what we ourselves have focused on. And as I told you in the beginning, when we started, we were told, you don't need this amount of power. You know, that was the biggest challenge. And we said, look, we have a deficit, right? So don't say these are our current requirements. We want you to look at what are tomorrow's requirements. What are tomorrow's requirements? And as such, and we started pushing through, we ourselves as government, through various initiatives, started powering up our primary schools. As a result of powering up our primary schools and powering up the neighboring communities around the schools, we saw ourselves pushing our connected citizens from something like 29% 3 years ago to almost 52%. And then all of a sudden people started taking note and saying, well, there is demand, right? And this in itself creates that bankability when people start to say, oh, wait a minute, I mean, there is actually, you know, demand. Africa is undersupplied, huh? Not oversupplied.
I think you're galvanizing President Kagame.
Yeah,
wanted to say something here.
Yeah, our African situation is a bit confusing in a sense. I have to, and that's the reason I mentioned at that time that I am ashamed on behalf of others as well. Let me give you just a quick example happening in our region, which will tell you a problem. You have heard of probably the project we have between Kenya, DRC, Burundi, and Rwanda. Rusizi 3, then Rusizi 4, which would give us enormous, yes, and the studies are there, the money is there, we have got funders. Imagine the funders are the ones running after us to give us money.
They're queuing up to give you their money.
Absolutely. And we are there holding back everything. This is something that would total up to close to 500 megawatts. And, you know, even last time in Washington during the World Bank board meetings, people go together, but so you try to, I even told our friends in the region that even if we have problems, or we want to have problems, so we are interested in those problems more than having electricity. Why don't we separate these two? Let's continue having our problems, but let's allow our citizens to have electricity so we can...
Please don't stop the development on the electricity
yes,
side.
because this is what I was saying. I said,
the focus.
Let's just...
The focus.
Yes.
The focus.
So, no, we've touched on something very interesting, and President Adesina, I want you to come in here, because you have both gentlemen made very important statements. President Kenyatta, yours was about, I mean, lots of important statements, so I'm not taking away from the other statements, but one that stands out right now is about tomorrow's energy requirement for Africa. And President Kagame has added to where I'm going with this thought process by saying the money is there. They're queuing up. They're waiting to give it to us. President Adesina, you have also stated that the money is available to finance Africa's energy solutions. And we go back to the Africa Progress Report of 2015, which says that $55 billion is needed annually up to 2030 to create universal energy access for all. $21 billion is being deployed in wasteful subsidies on an annual basis. The money is there. Tomorrow's energy requirements, we know what we need to achieve to hit universal energy access for all in Africa. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that when it comes to the issue of project preparation that you were saying, I think that's a very important point, that how to take projects to bankability. And that's why the African Development Bank with the African countries set up what's called Africa 50. It's one of the platforms that we set up to mobilize financing for this. As of last month, we have about $830 million subscription into that. And so that will help quite a lot in terms of project preparation. I just want to say that that's very crucial. But there are other things to unlock financing. One big issue is the risk. President Kagame was talking about. You got political risk sometimes, right? You've got project risk. You've got financial risk. So somebody has to step in and de-risk the entire financial value chain to go into the energy space. And that's where a multilateral development bank like ourselves, we do a lot of partial risk guarantees. We have a lot of partial credit enhancement facilities. We also, in fact, do support. Even MEGA facility works with us, the multilateral guarantee agency, to ensure political risk. I think this is very important because you can say the money is there. The question is, why is the money not going there? The money may not go there because the project is not well prepared. The money may not go there because the risk is high or the perception of the risk is high, so somebody has to actually de-risk that. But having said that, we've got to mobilize the money. And to your point, I firmly believe that the monies to actually close that gap is in Africa today.
Correct.
You take how much we have in terms of the tax revenue every year. It's gone up well. We're at about $500 billion a year. You take 10% of that and you put it to what President Kenyatta says our number one problem, energy. You're there. That's the gap right there. The second is the fact that the money that also belongs to people shouldn't be found in other people's personal accounts, right? So we got illicit capital flows of $60 billion in the continent. We end that. We light up this continent right like that. And finally, it's the fact that, it doesn't matter how much efficiency you want on energy. People look at energy efficiency. Efficiency multiplied by 0 is 0, right? You've got to actually have more money. And that's why I'm saying that for our countries, it's very important for the share of the GDP going into the energy space to be increased. As we increase that to about 3.4% from 0.3%, we'll get about $54 billion a year. And don't forget, there's a huge amount of money sitting there in our pension funds on the continent, $334 billion. They are being invested in treasury bills in countries in which the real rate of interest for the next 10 years is negative, right? And yet we don't have access to electricity. Now, we've got to find a better way of actually leveraging all of that for Africa's development. There's nothing, what are we talking about? Darkness. You don't trade darkness. What are you going to trade? Where are we going to do with it? So I think that the critical thing is we've got to mobilize all of this capital and go into the energy. One last thing I just want to say on this is there's a big elephant in the room, which is always around coal. And I think that we've got to discuss that. we're not going to build houses with coal. We're not going to build roads with coal. Today, 46% of all the energy mix in OECD countries comes from coal. Several countries are increasing their coal shares. And I think today you have clean coal technology that allows you to be able to use coal and don't make the mistakes of the past. And some people can say, well, we don't want you to make the mistake that we made. Well, if you made certain mistakes that made you rich, that seems to me like a very good mistake to make, right? However, today, if you take forget emotions, forget ideology, let's look at the numbers. In Africa today, CO2 emissions coming out of the 85% we have coming out of our relying on biomass. Average household generates 5 tons of CO2 per year currently in what we call the energy mix of Africa. If you go to clean coal technology with supercritical technology, you reduce that in Africa down to 1 ton per person per year. If you go to ultra supercritical technology, which reduces the particulates to about 99.9%, your sulfur oxide down to about 98.5%, and also your nitrous oxide to about 98.3%, you go to 0.9%.
So a brilliant formula.
No, but what I want to say is just because President Kagame talks, we know him as one of our technology wonks presidents. Both of them are. We think that the issue is Africa doesn't need pity. Africa needs support in terms of technology, innovation, to unlock all of the resources that it has. It cannot develop from what it doesn't have. It has to develop from what it has and do it in a way that's environmentally sound. The worst thing for the environment on this continent is lack of energy.
Are we embracing those technologies, gentlemen, specifically in investigating the clean coal scenario? And perhaps, President Kagame, you want to take this?
Yes, that is already happening in my country. For example, we have a European company that is investing in generation of power from peat. Peat is similar to coal. But because of good technology being used, I think we are going to have a lot of electricity from this resource we have, and without too much emission of carbon dioxide. So that is the way to go. If you can have these resources that are doubtable in terms of clean energy, but also using the newest technologies available on the market, then we mitigate the problem, as the President of Africa.
President Kenyatta, your experience with clean coal technologies?
Let me put it this way. We have one plant that is currently, again, private sector driven, that is currently in the works in one of our towns. So the fact of the matter remains that the technology exists. We don't have to be concerned about that. The technology exists. And they are focusing on that in our Lamu project because we are quite clear on all these issues of emissions, but they have assured us. And really, it's not a question of assurance because we know the technology is there. The big question is going to be, can we utilize this technology and still be able to have affordable, cost-effective tariffs? All right? So what we have said is that we will look at geothermal, we will look at coal, we will look at, all the resources that we have. All right? But the key thing for us is that at the end of the day, we must get our energy at a cost that keeps us globally competitive, right? The rest is for the private sector to do, and for them, they have that technology. We will set up the regulatory framework, the emissions framework. The rest is theirs, right? You do it, give it to us at this cost.
Well, let me just say something about the technology mix issue. Is that, if you don't have food, and somebody brings food to you and you're starving. And you don't have the choice to ask, I want to know whether this is organic food or non-organic food, right? If you don't have electricity at all, we are starving. Africa's situation on electricity, we are at zero. And so if you connect people to electricity who have never been in darkness for years, right, they're not going to ask you, well, is that source that you have a clean source or a non-clean source?
We know, President
right?
Adesina, it goes to what I was saying earlier. Why do we care about climate change?
I am all for the environment, but I'm also more for pragmatism and the very fact that Africa can't wait. Look, we've got 3,500 Africans dead at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Even insects move from where it's dark to where there's light. And so as we accelerate the investment in energy, we get our young people to work. We get small and medium enterprises to work. We get industries, the heads of that are talking to work. We create jobs for the young people, right? Terrorists operate better in the dark, right? Where everywhere is dark, right? You got just terrorist movements all over the place. So from a security perspective, from an economic growth perspective, from the industrialization competitive, Africa needs to move fast. And I think what you're hearing from these presidents, what you're hearing from us, is that we're simply tired. You know, we're simply tired of not having electricity. Look, if I have electricity, over time, we at the bank, we are supporting grid, we're supporting mini-grid, we're going to support off-grid, we're going to support renewables. We're going to support gas. We're going to support those that want to use coal. We want you to use the best technology ever. Use everything.
In fact, we are tired of poverty. We are tired of bad environment. So we need to deal with both at the same time. So one way of dealing with both at the same time is to invest in industrialization. So as we invest in industrialization, we have to be thinking about these clean technologies, but that allow us to power industries. We can't be without industries. In fact, sometimes when people have just talked about renewables, that's fine. They can only serve us that much. So what happens to the rest? If there were availability of renewables, affordable and could power industries, then that's the best choice. That's what. But
so it's about deploying a dual development path.
Yes. So we have to be
laying
realistic.
The foundation for low carbon strategies while pursuing the development of traditional energy resources.
I think that dual strategy is the pragmatic strategy, right? The president here, you look at Rusizi that President Kagame mentioned, even the methane work that they are doing, and the great work, in fact, the Lake Turkana work, which we also financed in Kenya. We, as an African Development Bank, we are all for accelerating renewable energy in this continent. And we will fund a lot of it. We will even provide preferential financing for that. I'm all for that. But I'm also a very pragmatic person to know that today, right, we're way behind on everything. President Kagame, we were with him, when we were having the debate on Fourth Industrial Revolution. We missed the first one. We missed the second one. We missed the third one. Now, you can have 10 industrial revolutions. Every single one of them, none of them works on air. All of them works on energy. They work on power. And that's why we think the narrative on Africa's energy needs to change. Look, if you have an y-axis and an x-axis, if you have somebody here who has a lot, they can transition fast. They can have a decay and go down. If you are at zero, the only place you can go is negative, right? So you've got what Africa needs in narrative. It needs an energy boost. It needs the right energy mix. But we need pragmatism on this issue, not ideology.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add one more statement. Again, it comes from the Africa Progress Report, and that is the analogy. When we look at the mobile environment and the leapfrogging, we use that term ad nauseum sometimes, but we leapfrog the fixed line infrastructure with mobile technology. There is just a thought, and I don't want to debate it now further than we have.
Frogs. if you leapfrog, you don't go anywhere, yeah?
You can't kill my statement before I come to the crescendo. I'm just saying, let's put it out there that renewable energy could help us as we develop both of those.
Absolutely.
As you say,
Yeah.
it could help us leapfrog that traditional infrastructure requirement. Let's go back to the New Deal on energy for Africa. $12 billion on the table from the African Development Bank over a 5-year period. You want to encourage private sector investors to match you, more than match you, on that investment in Africa's energy space. You want universal access to energy for all by 2025. You're driving an ambitious agenda. The final word to you, sir.
Well, let me say that in terms of development, political will is the currency for development. And when you have leaders like this that are very committed, it makes things possible. It gives you an inspiration that you can do anything that you put your mind to. Money is not the most important thing. It's the political will to actually do the change. And I think that's what you have with the heads of state that we have here and several others. The second thing is that the African Development Bank is not going to do it alone. And that's why we launched what's called the Transformative Partnership on Energy. President Obama has a great initiative, President Obama's initiative on Africa, Power Africa, the Sustainable Energy for All of the United Nations Secretary General. We have the UK government, we have China, we have Japan, we have so many countries, Germany and so on, that are all involved. So we're going to work together in partnership to be able to mobilize the resources, to be able to de-risk the investment, including the World Bank, by the way, but also to be able to ensure that we can actually do practical things, as the President is saying. The approach to the New Deal, it's business-like. We're going to look at what we can replicate and do it faster, right? That's really the key thing. But I want to say that accountability is very crucial. I am absolutely confident that with the kind of political we will have, with our own commitment, the support we have from our Board of Governors and Board of Directors, and also from our partners in this new time for Africa to have universal access to electricity, I'm confident that we'll get there. China got there. Malaysia got there. You look at Vietnam, it got there in a very short period of time. There's absolutely no reason at all why within 10 years, Africa should not be totally lit up. No reason at all.
Absolutely.
Thank you for your commitment, for your honesty, and thank you very much for joining us for this debate. There's no doubt that Africa's energy deficit is a huge challenge, but it is also an enormous opportunity, potentially with a triple dividend: reducing poverty, stimulating economic growth, and if we do deploy a low-carbon path to development, then we are looking at a sustainable planet, and that is for your children, your great-grandchildren, and your great-great-grandchildren. That's certainly a legacy worth investing in. Thank you very much. Thank you.